Hi, welcome to Church for Skeptics. I'm going to warn you ahead of time, I'm going to have to refer to my notes a little bit. I just rewrote this program last night for the third time or so, trying to get it right. The last few programs, we've really tried to stay on the theme in general of can we be good without God? We'll even call that program that. Is there goodness without God? I think we may have even used that same title for a previous program a few seasons ago. Richard Dawkins says, maybe I'm a Pollyanna. In other words, maybe I'm just naive to think that people would do the right thing without the big policeman in the sky. And that's not a direct quote, but that's the gist of what he's saying here, the big policeman in the sky being God. Of course, that's in opposition to especially the Christian worldview that we've talked about this recently, that man is a fallen being and intrinsically selfish. On the one hand, Richard Dawkins agrees with that we have a selfish gene and we are bent towards our own survival at the expense of whoever gets in the way of that. On the other hand, then, they want to say that we are evolving and we have such an altruistic gene now. I don't know that that gene's been identified, but I think it's just assumed as a circular argument again that evolution is true and that everything can be explained by evolution and the evolving of our genes that determine what we do and who we are. But my problem with Dawkins being a Pollyanna, and I agree if he really thinks that, he certainly is that if we don't need God to be good, why do we need a police force? Why do we need a legal system at all? If we are intrinsically good, or we are evolving towards being better and better in the sense of treating each other better and better, why all the crime, why the 20th century, which we'll go into a little bit more detail later? I just don't think that science can provide the answers to that. Let me park that and make another point here. In the last few programs, we've tried to make the point that when scientists who are atheists draw conclusions about the universe, about the existence of God, about any metaphysical reality, they're really revealing more about themselves than they are about either science or religion. And I'm going to say that a few times here in the program. What history reveals is human nature. Whether you're a priest or a scientist doesn't change who you are as a human being. From the book of Romans, I want to make a few statements here that I think are just bedrock to what we're trying to accomplish and the things that I want you to remember, maybe the takeaway from all these programs. And I realize we're coming back around again and again, kind of at the same point, the simple syllogism. If morality exists, then God must exist. Point number one. Number two, morality does exist. There is a right and wrong. We can't get away from it. We speak that way even if we say we don't believe in absolute morality. We can't live that way. I've referred to David Berlinski a lot, and I will in this program too. He says in our current culture today, we say at least, we believe that there's no absolute truth, and if there's no absolute truth, certainly there's no absolute moral truth. And he says nobody really believes the first premise that there is no absolute truth. They reveal it in their conversations every time they make a conclusive statement. And nobody can live with the second premise, that there's no absolute morality. They only raise that issue if you're trying to, quote unquote, enforce your morality, what they ascribe as your morality, on them. Romans teaches these several things here. Number one, it teaches that it is our nature, fallen human nature, to attempt at any cost to escape from God. We do not want to be judged. We do not want to be ruled over. That's the first point. It's just intrinsic in our nature. We have what one of the scientists I quoted last week called, I think it was Thomas Nagel, a cosmic authority problem, and we certainly do. The second point that Romans makes that I just see so clearly is that when we do think we have escaped God and we leave God out of our thinking, the fool has said in his heart there is no God, So that's Psalm 14:1, by the way. When we do that, our thinking process becomes nonsense. It leads to absurdities. And what I've noticed, this came to me last night as I was here writing this, all of this freedom from God in our thinking, in our cultural thinking today, according to the evolutionists, and you can be an evolutionist and be a Christian, of course, but we owe this freedom from God not to a reasonable, rational process, though that's the banner. You know, we're the safeguards of reason. We stand behind reason, and we've reached all these conclusions based on reason. But the truth is, if their worldview is correct, we've come to this place of escaping God in our thinking based on a blind, natural process, because that's all there is in a naturalistic universe. Everything is natural. Everything is predetermined or determined by a process over which we have no control at all. So there are so many contradictions and circularities in their worldviews, and I just have come, I believe with all my heart, to see that more and more and more clearly. That once you leave God out of the equation as the beginning point, as the starting point, it leads to all kinds of problems, absurdities. As one former Soviet dissident who managed to live through the days of Soviet Russia said, and he said it in response to Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and all the new atheists who seem to make no connection between atheism and the horrors of Stalinism in Russia. But this man who lived through it said, let them come to Russia and see that when we killed God, we killed ourselves. And that's kind of the point that I want to make today. Here's a question for you. Do you really think that science has shown atheism to be true? Do you really think that scientific pursuit, what a gift from God, what a great ability, has really proven that there is no God? If the more science can tell us about nature and how it works and the complexities, it seems to me the opposite. And I'll say it again, the conclusions of atheism about science tell us more about the scientist or the person, whether he's a scientist or not, than they do about either science or religion. You know, on the one hand, we've got this big argument going on that there's this great conflict between science and religion or faith, and to them all faith is blind faith. There's no conflict there. And science is not the problem. People are the problem. Religion is a problem if it's false religion, to be sure, but religion intrinsically is not the problem. Again, people are the problem. You can hijack science or religion to do evil things. So we're going to talk about these things today in a little more detail, and we'll give you some concrete examples of what I'm talking about. Can we be good without God? You can be good you can do good things without believing in God, to be sure. I don't mean to imply that all atheists are bad or terrible people. Certainly they're not. Nor do I mean to imply that all religious people are good people or do good things. Certainly that's not the case either. The common thread between both is human nature. Stay with us. We referred in a previous program to one of the admissions of an atheist who is a scientist, Richard Lewontin, who is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, who admitted that, he said, we take the side of science no matter what, no matter how absurd our conclusions are, no matter how failed our promises are, and he goes on to describe that. But then he says at the end, the reason that we do this is not because we're compelled, and this is really important and revealing. He says we're not compelled by science, good science, to take the materialist or naturalist viewpoint, but we do it because we have a prior commitment to naturalism. And then he says the reason we do that is because we cannot let the divine foot in the door. To which David Berlinski comments, how awful would that be? And even worse if the whole torso got in, demanding entry of God. But I think that's so revealing that here's a guy who admits he's a great scientist. I mean, he won the Nobel Prize. How is it that Isaac Newton, Louis Pasteur, Boyle chemistry, and most of the fathers of our scientific pursuits viewed the same data, not to the detail and not to the extent that modern day current science has, of course. It's just wonderful how it's built upon prior knowledge, but they were starting from scratch, so to speak. And the more complex, the more improbable, and the more beautiful that they saw creation, the more they, and here's a really important word, the more they inferred the existence of God. For them, it's exactly, I mean, it just confirmed what Scripture says, that the heavens declare the glory of God. They saw the impossibility, not just improbability, but the impossibility of our complex universe arising by chance, by a pure natural process. So these early scientists just saw God everywhere, and they believed that there was order in the universe because of God's existence. Remember that word inference. It means arriving at the best explanation according to the evidence provided. Now, when somebody like Richard Dawkins, who's presumably a really good scientist, a biologist, sees even more evidence that is not at all incompatible with the evidence that Newton saw or Pasteur saw, he thinks the inference is that there's nothing that caused it. No matter how improbable, no matter how impossible, by chance, there's nothing inferred. So, I mean, he wants to make the point that science has proven that there is no God, or at least that God is highly improbable. As I said at the beginning, we'll keep coming back to this, that says a lot more about the two different kinds of men than it does about either the evidence or the data or religion or science. It's talking about our prior commitments, as Lewontin said. Well, I want to go back all the way to the 11th century, and a Muslim philosopher, I'm going to read you his name, it's a very long one, Abu Hamid Muhammad al-Ghazali. We'll call him Al-Ghazali, and he was known as the Gazelle. It's interesting to me that David Berlinski, remember, who is a secular Jew and agnostic. He's not, this is the important thing about reading him, and I highly recommend that you do, or go on YouTube and find him. He's all over there. He's not trying to prove the existence of God. He's not trying to prove Christianity to be true. He makes no statements about that. What he is seeing clearly and trying to show and willing to show it publicly as himself a brilliant mathematician, and he dabbles in all kinds of science. He's just a brilliant thinker. What he's trying to show is the absurdity of the claim that science has disproven God. He's also trying to show the ramifications of a universe that has no God, even though he's not sure God exists. So he talks about, and of course he's a secular Jew, so here he is applauding and quoting and referencing this 11th century Muslim philosopher. I think that's pretty remarkable and says a lot about his willingness to take the truth wherever he finds it. Now, this is pretty remarkable for a guy in the 11th century, Muslim or no Muslim. Al-Ghazali applauds, on the one hand, the scientists, and he calls, this is amazing, in the 11th century he calls them scientists, and he calls them naturalists. And these were a group of people in the early days of scientific pursuit, I suppose you could say the pre-runners of the Renaissance, who were doing scientific experiments and examining anatomy in particular, and astronomy as well. And he applauds them for their pursuits because, he says, the more we learn about science, the more we learn about nature, the more it reveals the handiwork of God. So he and I, him being a Muslim, me being a Christian, would be in complete agreement about that. So first he applauds them, but then immediately he withdraws his applause. And he says their view that nature is all there is, naturalists, presents two problems, one scientific and one, or philosophically scientific, and the other moral. And I think he's brilliant in this. On a scientific level, he says, if the brain is merely made of matter, how is it then that this physical brain can look into and comprehend and understand the heart of the universe? And of course, there's still a lot we don't understand. But how is it possible that this brain can conceive of all these things, can understand all these things? If the brain is just physical and all we are is material, the brain is just our part of us that runs our bodies, not by reason, but by determined genetics. He wouldn't have used those terms, of course. But he says that's a very curious thing. And he says it's almost like if the liver, in addition to producing bile, could suddenly and unexpectedly discover that it had a great ability to play the violin. It just doesn't make sense. Well, it doesn't make sense that a glob of matter situated in our head has the ability to comprehend and understand science itself, reason itself, the reasoning process itself. So that's just, by the way, science has never answered that question. The whole idea of consciousness and the mind-body problem we've discussed on prior programs. Scientific evolution and Darwinism have never answered that question. Darwin had doubts about it himself. He said, if my brain is just a product of a blind evolutionary process, why should I think I know any more than a monkey? Well, the second problem that the Ghazali, Ghazali pointed out is moral. He said, if these naturalists are right, then when we die, since we're only matter, we turn to dust and there is no afterlife. He says if that's true, then there is no justice in the end, no reward for good behavior, and I'm giving you his viewpoint, no punishment for evil behavior, no judgment. And he says if that were true, now get this, that it doesn't really make any difference how we live our lives because there is no judgment at the end of it, then men and women, and he says, will give themselves over to what he calls a bestial indulgence of their appetites. And I want you to remember that phrase, bestial meaning animalistic. In other words, we'll kind of turn into animals, just satisfying our own physical cravings. That's all we will be in the end, because that's all we are in the end. Christianity takes an even stronger view than Al-Ghazali as a Muslim did. Remember, we talked about this, and if you haven't watched the program, this will be new to you, but Christianity's view is that human nature is corrupt, not neutral. That because we, in our separation from God, which happened all the way back in the Garden of Eden, that we are corrupt. Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is desperately wicked and deceitful above all things. And in the New International Version, it says it's beyond cure. So that's an even stronger view, I think, than Al-Ghazali would have taken. And then the beauty to me of Christianity is that having presented an insolvable problem, human nature, it offers the cure that it says, in one sense, is not there, which is the grace and mercy of God offered in Jesus Christ. But the point that I want to make here at the beginning is that without judgment, without justice, without the possibility of setting things right, setting the world right, setting us right, having all things become equal, that's really what justice is. It's a moral equality. The equation works out. Without that, life loses its meaning. I'm going to read you a portion of a book here that I highly recommend to you, and I've used it plenty of times, so it may sound familiar to you. It's called The Reason for God, and it's written by Timothy Keller, a brilliant thinker, I believe, and the pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in Manhattan, which has been there for 20 plus years now. He quotes the playwright Arthur Miller through his character Quentin in the play After the Fall. And Quentin says this, and I just want to read what he says to you. It's not long. But the idea is that it is judgment, the existence of good or evil, that did we do a good job, a bad job, or were we good people, bad people, did we do the right thing or the wrong thing? That's the only thing that really gives life meaning. If there is no difference, as I've said many times, it makes no difference if you're Mother Teresa or Adolf Hitler, because the end of your life is exactly the same. No matter what numbers you put in the equation, they all add up to zero. But here's what Quentin says in the play After the Fall. He says, "For many years, I looked at life like a case at law. It was a series of proofs. When you're young, you prove how brave you are, or how smart, then what a good lover, then a good father, and finally how wise or powerful or whatever." But here's what he says, "Underlying it all, I see now there was a presumption that one moved on an upward path towards some elevation where, God knows what, I would be justified or even condemned." In other words, what he's saying is, and I hate to interrupt Quentin here, but what he's saying is there is a goal, there is a target. As C.S. Lewis would say, there is a Tao, the way things ought to be, and that's what gives life meaning, is that there is a purpose for it. Atheism, the only logical conclusion is we live our lives, that's it, we go into oblivion, there's no afterlife, and so there's no meaning to it. It doesn't matter what we do in the end. But here's what Quentin says. He says, "Underlying it all, I see now there was a presumption that one moved on an upward path towards some elevation where, God knows what, I would be justified or even condemned. A verdict anyway. I think now that my disaster really began when I looked up one day and the bench was empty, no judge in sight, and all that remained was the endless argument with oneself, this pointless litigation of existence before an empty bench," which of course is another way of saying despair. I almost want to read that again and talk about it at more depth, but what he's talking about here is what we see going on, endless litigation. What difference does it make? I've often asked the question, why would somebody who thinks there is no God and we're going to live 70 or 80 years at the most, and then that's it, we're all going to the same oblivion, it doesn't matter, why would they care what I believe? Why would they feel a need to convince me that atheism is true? What difference does it make, especially if I'm genetically determined to be religious and they're genetically determined to be atheists? In the first place, they couldn't change my mind because I don't have one. According to them, I only have a brain. They would have to perform some kind of lobotomy to change my beliefs. It just doesn't make sense. Now, granted, they say they have come out as atheists and want to convince the world of atheism because of 9/11. I understand that and have some sympathy towards that, but they're basically throwing out the baby with the bathwater in accordance with their human nature. Let's take advantage of this opportunity to just get rid of God altogether. I realize I'm kind of running around the barn a little bit and coming at this from all different angles. I'll just say this. My favorite argument for the existence of God is the moral argument. It's kind of a long step from the Kalam argument, the idea that the universe had to have a cause outside of itself, and I think that's certainly true, but it's a long step from that argument to Christianity, the God of the Bible. But it's a very short step from the moral argument. And I'll go back and give you the basic syllogism. If God doesn't exist, then morality doesn't exist. If morality is true, and there really is a right and wrong, there has to be a God. There has to be some purpose and intent behind the universe, a moral intent. And I think we all know that morality is hardwired into the nature of the universe. But here's what I think. Religion can be just as much without God as science can be without God. Both theology needs God. I know theology is the study of God, so to speak, but religion has been just as godless as scientific atheism is godless. And when religion becomes godless, that is, it lacks the relationship with the true God, it's going to be hijacked by evil. I heard a preacher say one time that Satan's biggest enterprise was religion, not pornography or drugs or sex trafficking, and all those things being horrible. But his greatest enterprise was religion, because it can inoculate you, just give you just enough to inoculate you against the real thing. So religion produced the Inquisition. There's no doubt about that. But it's human nature using religion for their own purposes that produced the Inquisition. And by the way, if you want to read a detailed account of all the implements of torture used in the Inquisition to purge out unbelief, just read Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith. He gives you a detailed description of it and just milks it for all it's worth. And about 10,000 people actually died during the Inquisition. They were put to death. Many were exiled. Science without God, on the other hand, produced the 20th century. And no matter who you take, Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, all saw religion. Even Hitler, who used the church but hated it, to them, religion, God were the enemy. Think about what I'm saying. And of course everybody but Hitler would have said that. Hitler believed in destiny and fate, but he hated Christianity and thought it was weak. He hated morality and thought it was weak. He was a student of Nietzsche. In particular, they hated Christianity. They're certainly not going to be remembered as religious leaders, and indeed the 20th century was zillions of times worse than the Inquisition. So it doesn't matter if human nature tries to use religion for its own purposes, it's going to turn out bad. If human nature tries to use science for its own purposes, it's going to turn out worse because the technology is better. Al-Ghazali warned of this, that once you lose this idea of an absolute morality and judgment, you are going to be given over to a bestial indulgence of your appetites. Dostoevsky in the 19th century gives the same warning, through his character Ivan, the brothers Karamazov, he says, if God does not exist, in the end, everything is permitted. And the new secular syllogism, and remember the word secular stands in opposition to the word sacred. Sacred, the idea that we are created in the image of God and your life is sacred. You can divide the 10 Commandments into what is sacred. God is sacred, your relationship with God is sacred, your relationship with your neighbor, with your wife, and even your property is sacred, and so is your neighbor's. That's the whole basis of it. But the new secular syllogism is this: if God does not exist, everything is permissible. If science is true, God does not exist, according to today's mantra. So the conclusion is, if science is true, everything is permissible. And if nature is all there is, who's to say otherwise?